welcome back to the Lamppost Listener. My name is Daniel.
I'm Phil.
And this is a podcast where we chronicle transcendent truth by traveling further up and further into the classic works of children's literature.
This is Season 9, Episode 13, The Kiss, which covers chapters 28 through 30 of The Princess and the Goblin.
And we are here at almost the very end of the story. Just one more episode to cover in this book. Next time we're back, we'll have... Look, I'm already saying as if we're leaving, but we're just getting started with these chapters. But in our next episode, we've just got 2 more chapters of the book.
This is the last episode with 3 chapters.
Correct.
Of The Princess and the Goblin.
There was a little bit of discussion, a lot of fighting, actually. You and I just really made it looked like the podcast might end.
A lot of feathers strewn all over.
About how to put these last 2 chapters. You wanted to do just say, well, they're not divisible by 3, so we just won't cover them. Which it doesn't.
We all know what happens.
And I was like, we should shove them into this one and have a 5-chapter episode. We decided to split the difference, and we'll do an episode with just 2 chapters.
Right. Leave them for a little bit later. More time to talk about Star Wars because we will have one less chapter.
Well, that's true. That's what we'll do. Yeah. We'll have those, and then I guess this is a good time, I guess, to talk about how the rest of the season is going to pan out, right?
Right.
We'll have we'll finish up The Princess and the Goblin, and then we're going to do
a series of essays.
Written anonymously. No, we'll have one essay, The Fantastic Imagination by MacDonald, and then as a pivot to Season 10. That's right, Season 10 this fall.
Season X.
Yes, Season X. We're going to call it Season 10 because that's just going to confuse people. But as we in the lead up to that, the last 2 episodes of this season, we're going to cover J.R.R. Tolkien's Smith of Wootton Major, which is actually related to MacDonald because it began as part of a preface by Tolkien to The Golden Key by George MacDonald. So it actually began as this kind of bridge, and so it seems like it will be a perfect bridge for us to leave George MacDonald and to go into Tolkien so that we can read The Hobbit this fall.
There it is. We're doing The Hobbit.
Yes,
it only took 9 seasons.
We've had lots and lots of people ask us to cover The Hobbit. We always knew we wanted to cover it. We weren't sure. We knew we didn't want to do it directly after Narnia, but
Daniel needed to rest his Narnia voices so that he could fully gear up for
Gollum and Smaug,
Schmeagol Gollum voice.
We were thinking about even do it later on, but I have just about to. We're on the very last chapter. My son and I have been reading through The Hobbit. And I thought, no, this is the time. I feel I'm having so much fun with it, and I want to dive into it on the podcast. And so, we're going to start this fall, and it's a long season. We're looking at so far 24 episodes covering The Hobbit, which I'm really, you are looking stressed about that.
Good thing you replaced me with AI.
No. Well, there's just 19 chapters. So we've got, and then we obviously want to talk about your favorite movies, the Hobbit trilogy. You're a big fan. And we've got some other fun things coming up in that season as well, too. So we still got a lot more of MacDonald to cover these next few chapters, but we also are now looking ahead to the transition into Tolkien.
Yeah.
Well, let's get back to The Kiss, which is the name of this episode. And that kiss has to do with Irene's promise that she fulfills at the very end of these 3 chapters, and that's in chapter 30. Why don't you go ahead, Phil, and read us our summary, and we can dive in.
The following is a summary of chapters 28 through 30. Curdie arrives at his house to discover Irene fast asleep in his own mother's arms. Everyone catches up on the latest with the goblins and sits down to breakfast, when Curdie, suddenly remembering the information he must communicate, rushes out with his father to alert the other miners. The mine secured, Curdie makes his way back, which takes longer than usual due to the flooding from the storm. Instead of returning the princess to her people, the family decides to wait until the morning, when it is safer. The sight of Irene brings the color back to her King Papa's face, and when asked, he confirms that she must keep her promise. Curdie receives his kiss, and everyone returns to the house, where Peter and the miners are invited to join in a great feast.
All right. So all of the fear that we had in the last episodes, we thought, what is happening to Irene? She's been taken by these goblins, is pretty quickly dissipated here because Curdie leads us within the first, page, I guess, right to his house where Irene's just fine.
Totally fine, safe and secure. warmed by the fire, asleep in Curdie's mother's arms.
Yes. And of course, it is the grandmother's thread who leads him there. So in chapter 28, Curdie's guide, Curdie, as he's kind of all this is dawning in front of him, he's like, oh no, what has happened? Irene's been taken. We should have gone right after her. We should have stopped the goblins. He feels, here's what MacDonald says. Something touched his hand. It was the slightest touch. And when he looked, he could see nothing. Feeling and peering about in the gray of the dawn, his fingers came upon a tight thread. He looked again, and narrowly, but still could see nothing. It flashed upon him that this must be the princess's thread. Without saying a word, for he knew no one would believe him any more than he had believed the princess, he followed the thread with his finger, contrived to give Ludi the slip, and was soon out of the house and on the mountainside, surprised that, if the thread were indeed her grandmother's messenger, it should have led the princess, as he supposed it must, into the mountain, where she would be certain to meet the goblins rushing back in rage from their defeat. But he hurried on in the hope of overtaking her first. So then we go on, and that's exactly where he ends up at the house. What's really interesting here, the way that MacDonald presents this, is that it's not actually a thread from the grandmother to Curdie. He's just kind of stumbling on the thread that was Irene's escape route.
It's the same thread.
Or at least that's what he believes, because we just heard MacDonald say he's surprised because he assumed that it would lead her, into the mountain where she'd be able to meet the goblin. Or he would assume that it was left for him. Like he's thinking, oh, it's going to lead me into the mountain so I can go find her. Because the very last time that the thread was used, it led Irene to Curdie. But what's interesting here about the way that our expectations are not necessarily met is it isn't the inverse of first Irene going to save Curdie and now Curdie going to save Irene. It's Irene went to go save Curdie, and then Irene kind of saved herself. Yeah. I mean, it was always the grandmother. Obviously, she's not actually saving herself. But Curdie doesn't show up as the heroic rescuer here of the princess, which we would maybe assume. Especially reading a Victorian fairy tale, I just kind of assumed he would show up and be the kind of heroic rescuer of the princess.
That's part of my curiosity. Is this different to us because we grew up in the 90s with the Disney tales that we had at the time? And then this does seem very similar to the tales that are being told maybe the past 10 years, where they're very conscious to not have the prince always save the princess.
Yeah, they're like there's this like almost fear of telling that kind of story a lot of times in the modern world.
There's just a reaction to it because we had so much of that. But even in kind of more superhero, which is a modern form of the same kind of fairy tale arc, it's this mysterious power that somebody has, and then people are saving people. But just rewatching Spider-Man, the Tobey Maguire ones recently, he keeps saving the princess. Over and over and over again, multiple times in a movie sometimes, and then multiple movies, same kind of thing. And I'm curious, was this different? Was this a reaction to something? Was he trying to do something different? Because this was so long ago, and this was written in the 1800s, right?
No, obviously, it's written in the 19th century. He definitely has. MacDonald obviously knows his fairy tales so well. He knows even the most basic of and I don't mean basic in they're boring or just simple. I mean fundamental to the genre itself. He knows Andersen. He knows the Brothers Grimm. He knows Perrault, right? A lot of these fairy tellers, right, are telling, stories that very much have kind of the beats that they go by. I think what's different about MacDonald's approach to this story is that he's not subverting our expectations to simply try to respond to, there's been too much of this narrative in the past, and so therefore it's kind of on me to correct it. I don't think that's what he's doing. And I don't think that's what all kind of modern movies are doing. But I think there are a lot that are kind of we're just telling the story because we're trying to correct what we see as something that's either wrong or boring or not as exciting or enticing or not even up to kind of our minds anymore.
I feel like the first few to do it were trying to do that. most likely, and then the rest were following the trend.
Oh, and
Where
now
it's
that's
just-
become the
it's-
trend. That's the norm.
It's
yeah.
no longer surprising, and I'm curious if we will have it flip back.
Oh,
where
interesting.
The surprise is that, this is actually doing
Like
the
it's a
original type of
cliche
story.
of saving the princess, and so we've a lot of modern stories push back at that, and then maybe in like the 24th century we'll be telling similar. No, I think what's different about McDonald is that he's not trying to subvert your expectations for either of those two reasons. Either because it's let me go ahead and try to retell this story in a kind of a more Victorian sense to kind of push back against the past. I don't think it's that. And I also don't think let me just simply subvert your expectations for the sake of subverting your expectations. We see a lot of that too, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, think about, we're not going to get back into The Last Jedi, but think about how much frustration people had with feeling, whether that was Rian Johnson's, point or not. Even if he wasn't trying to subvert expectations for the sake of subverting expectations, many people certainly felt that was the case.
Yeah.
And you and I have mellowed on that movie significantly.
Well, you have. I still like it.
You still like it a lot.
I'm not rewatching it as much, but part of that's because you keep talking down about it.
It's funny. I know we talked about it a lot on the Dancing Lawn, but I am. I wouldn't say I have the same level of disdain that a lot of people have for it, but there was a time where I was like, "Oh my gosh, this is one of the best Star Wars movies," and I'm like, it's not.
It's interesting how that works, but something different was done. I actually appreciated that they took a shot, but it has to fit within the whole trilogy, which
That's the problem, right?
He wasn't fully in control of, and I think you're disappointed in the overall trilogy. And even though you like the first one, it kind of brings stuff down. And I know this is a tangent about Star Wars, but I do think it matters in a storytelling sense, which is a lot of what we talk about.
Well, and I think so much of it for me is now that I've got children who enjoy Star Wars, it's really hard for me with Last Jedi in particular. Neither of our kids have any knowledge really of the sequel trilogy, and it's hard to be like, the hero that you love so much, he's going to try to murder his nephew in his sleep. And I can't, it's hard. Like Luke's story was already kind of, it should have been ended there. It was already over. I don't like what they do with Luke in that movie. And so we're not going to get onto that right now. My point is this. So there's a lot of,
this actually kind of there's a sequel to this book that we're talking about.
Correct.
But only one.
Only one.
And
in that one, Curdie also tries to murder his nephew.
Well, I didn't want to tell you.
Oh, no.
But I think there's something to having a story that ends.
Yeah.
And that is very different than the modern blockbuster way of doing stuff right now.
Mm-hmm.
Even stories that have an end are being changed because we're setting up for that next thing in a way that will work for a movie.
Mm-hmm.
And the example I'm thinking of is the way Dune Part 2 ended is very much setting up
Messiah.
the next one. Yeah, which Dune could have existed just by itself, and we would never have to do it. But there's way too much money at stake at this point, and I'm excited for it. I want there to be more too, and I would much rather it be planned than this kind of slap on a sequel, and then suddenly you have 7 of the movies because you kind of moved it to a cheaper place, to be made.
Well, going back, let's move back to what I was saying about McDonald here, if I can remember, and that's not a quip at you. That was me who got us off topic here. So that's not. I don't want anyone to think I'm
thinly veiled.
Yeah, that's no thinly veiled criticism towards you. That is definitely about me here. So I don't think McDonald is subverting expectations. I also don't think he's trying to kind of retell the story for a Victorian audience. He's not trying to update it. That's a better way to say it. He's not trying to update it. What I do think he's doing here is much more important and is much more transcendent. I think he wants us to know who it is that is the one who rescues. Who is it? Who is it that actually saves? And in both instances, Irene and now Curdie, really and truly, it would be hard to argue that either of them, from both a narrative perspective, meaning from us as readers outside of the story, but also from the characters inside of the story, it would be hard to argue that they are the actual saviors here. Because going back to Irene saving Curdie from the cave, I mean, she just literally wakes up, she gets scared about a monster, and she pulls a string, right? Like that's what calls her. Like it's not even like she does anything heroic. She gets scared out of bed and then pulls a string that leads her to Curdie, and she's able to save him. It is completely the grandmother who is the hero. Likewise here with Curdie. Curdie kind of bumps into the string and then just follows it. He's thinking, oh, it's leading me back to Irene and I'll be able to go save her, right? And it's like, oh, actually just leads him back to where she's already asleep in his own mother's arms, right? And that's not to actually, and again, this is where it's different than some more of the kind of newer stories that maybe try to kind of put down the hero here or at least de-emphasize the role. Curdie still is a hero, and he's a hero in multiple ways throughout the story. He's a hero for the way he defeats the goblins. He's going to be a hero in our next episode when he saves everyone from the impending flood. Spoiler alert, right? He very much is still a hero. But when it matters the most, McDonald wants it to be clear that it is the grandmother. It is the grandmother who does this. And we've made so many allusions to the kind of the ways in which she is this kind of divine figure for us. And I think that's what McDonald is doing here. I don't think it's the other two things. And I think those things might have their place in other stories, but it's not this story. The grandmother gets all the glory here.
Also, it stands out to me that Curdie takes a guess at how the string works, and he's wrong. And it doesn't really matter.
Oh, this is good, yeah.
Which furthers a pretty clear metaphor. And the metaphor was there. We talked about it extensively in the last episode. But this one makes it even more nuanced, where he's reacting to it based on what he thinks he knows, and he's off, and it still works. And I don't know if it ever talks about realizing how it actually works.
Yeah.
But it very much furthers the metaphor of this is how Christ might lead us in stuff. But it also seems like he's trusting more now, which is, as his faith is growing, a natural consequence.
Yeah. Oh, that's really good. I like that. I hadn't considered that.
Once they're all in the same place and they're catching up and they're talking about what's happened, Curdie reveals what the goblin's plan was. And Irene's reaction is, oh, how dreadful. But she's so comfortable and safe that it doesn't have the same impact. Curdie's really been through it. And he really tried to help. And he was basically arrested and then got out while there was an attack going on, followed this line by faith, which is new for him. And the whole time, Irene's just been hanging out with his parents.
You know, as that conversation continues, Curdie's telling more of the story, and he kind of lets slip, or at least just mentions, it's not really a secret, that he was injured. And his own mother's like, oh my gosh, are you okay? You actually look fine. And Curdie actually doesn't say that Irene's grandmother saved him. We kind of picked up on that in the last chapter. He said, I ought to be hurt, but I haven't even really thought about my wound. And as he shows that everything's, perfectly healed, it is Irene that says, I thought so, Curdie. I was sure it wasn't a dream. I was sure my grandmother had been to see you. Don't you smell the roses? It was my grandmother healed your leg and sent you to me. Curdie says this, though. Listen to this. No, Princess Irene. I wasn't good enough to be allowed to help you. I didn't believe you. Your grandmother took care of you without me. And so that's, again, what this idea I'm getting at, that it's the grandmother who is the one who does this. And Curdie is still heroic, but I love this side of him. We get that actually, there was, maybe he could have had a bigger role to play in this had he believed the grandmother the first time. That's a really interesting thing. Aslan would tell us that we can't know what would have happened, right? But I do kind of wonder what would have happened.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then for the most part, this chapter comes to an end. They decide, hey, we know everyone's going to be worried about the princess, but we should, let's get some food first. Let's eat.
This to me falls directly in line with the things that George MacDonald did that probably influenced Lewis. And always talking about food and everybody making sure to eat every single meal feels like a big influence.
I actually had a note that I thought this was very much not like Lewis.
Okay.
And here's why.
Let's hear it.
Because I thought if Lewis had written this, we would have known exactly what they had to eat for breakfast in exquisite detail.
Yes.
And all we have was they ate breakfast. We get no idea of what they're eating, and Lewis would have given us a very long list
the full array
of what the entire table looked like, what was in there, what it tasted like, and I do wish McDonald had told us a little bit more.
Yeah, that's funny.
Well, let's move on to chapter 29 here. That's Mason work here, and it's in this.
This is on page XXIX.
Well, not page, but chapter.
This is chapter XXIX.
XXIX. That is how Roman numerals work. Tell us about XXIX.
So he remembers that the goblins are going to carry out this second plan.
Mm-hmm.
And
oh yeah, sorry, I did interrupt you just for a minute. He leaves breakfast at the end of the last chapter and just runs out the door.
He runs out the door, but he gets his dad first.
Yeah.
So his dad's asleep and they're eating breakfast without him?
That's kind of rude.
I guess it's because he was up all night mining.
Yeah, I think he's probably at the mine maybe late, and so that's
maybe they'll make him a smoothie or something and leave.
Yeah, he got something else to eat later. So at the end of
someone who used to work later than everybody else,
yeah.
I really appreciate that.
So as Curdie darts out of the cottage, I think back to you. Where does he go here at the beginning of chapter 29?
He goes to the mine to warn the other miners because their safety is at risk.
Yes. What was that second plan, just in case listeners have forgotten?
Their plan was if they can't get the princess, they're just going to flood everything. Wash them out.
Just going to wash them out. We learned it. It's a little confusing, and actually the next episode, McDonald has something in chapter 30 that clears things up just a little bit. But where the goblins are relative to the miners as they are above them. See, I was confused earlier in the book when it said they were going to flood them because I guess in my head, since the humans live above ground, I assumed their mine was closer to the surface and the goblins were flooded out. I'm like, how are you going to flood them if they're above you? Like, that's not how gravity works. But we actually learn later on that the miners are actually below where the goblins' main caverns are. So it would make sense they'd be able to, if they knock out some of their water reservoir, they can actually drown out and flood the miners' cave.
Right. They're the humans are undermining the goblins, who are overmining.
Correct. Well done. And so all of this, so Curdie gets back there, he warns everybody, and then there's a huge storm that it comes. So he's time to go back, and here's what it says. For they stepped out into a tremendous storm, which was raging all over the mountain. This is Curdie and the rest of the miners. The thunder was bellowing, and the lightning lancing out of a huge black cloud which lay above it, and hung down its edges of thick mist over its sides. The lightning was breaking out of the mountain too, and flashing up into the cloud. From the state of the brooks, now swollen into raging torrents, it was evident the storm had been storming all day. This frightens Curdie because he thinks about the fact that and we didn't talk about this in the last chapter that McDonald wrote, but Curdie's house gets described just a little bit more in the chapter when he arrives, and it's really like a dirt floor. It's mostly just the shack in the woods, which it hadn't really been described like that when we were there with Curdie before. I wonder if it's the surroundings of having the princess there that makes him realize kind of what it feels like the inadequacy of his home.
Yeah, I feel like without any detail describing the house, we are going to assume a certain thing, and because of the genre, I was imagining wooden floors.
Oh, okay? Yeah.
But it's not.
It's not.
That's
no,
not the
yeah.
case.
So Curdie does make his way back to the cottage, and we learn that there's kind of a rock that is above the cottage on the mountain because it's kind of parting all of the water that's actually coming down the mountain. There's this flood coming down the mountain, but the cottage is safe because of the rock that is splitting the raging waters in two about it. So Curdie's actually able to make it back into the cottage where he sees Irene there. Just pause for a moment. I want to hear from you. Did you feel like this kind of came out of nowhere? Like this was like, I thought all the danger was over.
Yeah, this is one of the moments where you have to reread. I thought maybe the storm was because of the flooding that they were.
That was a little confusing too.
It just goes to show you can prevent a washout from a water attack just to get
rained on.
In a storm. It really does feel like this is building and building and building and getting worse and worse, which matches kind of reaching that climax of a story.
Yeah, so Curdie gets. Yeah, I mean, I felt the same way. I was a little confused at first. I was like, wait, did the goblins like do something to the weather? Like, because this working out pretty decently for them actually, you know. But Curdie does get back inside. Irene's so happy to see him. She gives out a joyous cry, and this is where we learn about the floor, because McDonald says the clay floor was one mass of mud, and the whole place looked wretched. But the faces of the mother and the princess shone as if their troubles only made them merrier. Curdie laughed at the sight of them. There's Irene. I never had such fun, said the princess, her eyes twinkling and her pretty teeth shining. How nice it must be to live in a cottage on the mountain. And like, I feel
she's really roughing it.
I know. I feel like she doesn't mean it, but this feels pretty rude, right? Like, she lives in a castle. Their house literally could be washed away at any moment. She's like, this is great here, y'all. It's so fun.
Yeah. Let's light some candles and
so
wait till the storm blows over.
Exactly. So this is right here at the end of the chapter. The storm is nearly over by the time that Peter, the father, returns. The streams were so fierce and so swollen that it was not only out of the question for the princess to go down the mountain, but most dangerous for Peter, even, or Curdie to make the attempt in the gathering darkness. So they waited, they had that breakfast, and now they can't go back. So it's been a little, the time is now kind of starting to hurt them. People are going to actually be worried about Irene, but they decide, hey, we really can't go. It just rained too much. And so Curdie's mother lays Irene down it says that she's laid in Curdie's bed, which was in a tiny little garret room. As soon as she was in bed, through a little window low down in the roof, she caught sight of her grandmother's lamp shining far away beneath, and she gazed at the beautiful silvery globe until she fell fast asleep. And that's the end of the chapter.
I love that glimpse. Just a little hint of what might be to come.
Well, it's also not even a hint of what's to come, because you're right. That's true. But even like presently, I guess we get the sense that grandmother's looking out for her. Even though she's not there, she still kind of is there taking care of her.
Yeah. Do you know what a garret room is?
I have no idea.
It is a habitable attic.
A habitable attic.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we actually have quite a few houses like this where the attic it's not big enough that you could stand up in necessarily, but it's enough that you can put a room, maybe put a chair, so someone could be up there, or they have a bed, but the slope of the roof is
like here in the neighborhood. We have some of the old houses like that.
Yeah.
I don't think I've seen this before.
Yeah, and it's not exact. It's not that maybe you could stand up in a piece of it, but the slope of the roof is definitely cutting into it.
We have a metal roof on our house, and it's like our attic is. You could. You still even can't stand up at the tallest part. You could crouch up, but by the end of it, it's like 6 inches tall by the time you get to the way back.
It goes all the way down.
And I know because we've had squirrels up there before. Didn't Anna and I talk about this?
Habitable.
Yeah. Oh, that's why I was like, I think I'd even made
that would be a garret room.
When your son was born, Anna and I had a whole Dancing Alone episode where we had a war on squirrels. I think that was even the name of the episode. But so I know all about my attic and how much space. So I guess. But I don't, not a garret room, because you have to even get a ladder from my shed to even get up there. Yeah, it's some wild stuff. Let's go
Apparently
on.
not. The squirrels did it without any of that stuff.
They came from the outside. Let's go to our final chapter for this episode.
Triple X.
State
of the Union.
That reference, dude. Oh, my goodness.
Every time I see the word kiss, I want to say, you know what the worst part about the kiss is?
What?
The Dementors.
All right. Chapter 30.
Which Office episode is that?
That's episode 9 of season 3.
Yeah, go look it up if you haven't seen
it. Chapter 30, The King and the Kiss. Again, another short chapter here, but a great chapter, because the next morning, Curdie's family, not his dad, Peter goes to work, but Curdie, his mom, and the princess make it down. And this is really a fairy tale ending here, because as they are approaching the castle, which I think we actually finally get confirmation that this is like the king's summer castle here. Yeah. We've kind of assumed that, but there's confirmation more or less that, this is kind of the castle he just comes to. And again, Irene she just spends her time there.
Yeah.
But the king is returning, and just as he is approaching is actually when they show up, which is really great. So he doesn't have to kind of go through a long realization of, oh, my daughter might be dead or something like that.
Yeah.
In
But
fact,
he is pretty forlorn.
he is. He's concerned, but they're able to get there pretty quickly. He does have some of the color that's left his face, but pretty quickly he's able to see, oh my goodness, it is my daughter and that she is safe.
Yeah. The men at arms too they have horror-stricken faces. It's described as eyes flashing with rage, waiting only for the word of the king to do something. They did not know what, and nobody knew what.
Yeah.
And this is one of those examples of maybe not the most flowery of writings.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the most beautiful sentence, but it really communicates and it moves the story forward. I can picture exactly what he's talking about. And I also think the repetition, they did not know what and nobody knew what, that is very effective. And it's a dark time for them.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that's a really good insight on MacDonald, because we haven't talked a ton these last few chapters or last few episodes that we've done about kind of those distinctions. And we spent an earlier part of the season talking about especially Lewis's thoughts on MacDonald. And when we had Justin Bailey on the show, he said that this was something he felt as though Lewis is just wrong here because he really likes some of MacDonald's writing. I would say that the more I've spent time in this book, the more I've gotten used to his prose and the less jarring it felt. Because it does feel a little jarring at first.
Yeah.
It's a combination of...
Or confusing sometimes.
And confusing. And there's still been... You and I hear it. It's funny. This book in particular compared to other books, when we read the Chronicles of Narnia, there was never really times in Narnia where like, what happened exactly? What's going on? And while you and I are by no means literary experts or scholars or anything, I like to think that we can read a children's book pretty decently, and
At this point.
at this point, right? I mean, it's our night job. So, but there's been a couple of times still where it's been a little confusing, but I think that the more time I spend with this Victorian prose and with MacDonald's particular approach to his writing, the more comfortable I'm becoming with it. And the more it does feel, I think too about that episode we did with your dad, the more it feels just, there's like a warmth to it that I didn't have at first. It felt almost a little cold, whereas Lewis always feels like a very...
Very warm.
But again, like some of that's Lewis's writing, and a lot of that's also I've spent so much of my life reading him that it feels comfortable, right? So it's fun to see some of that. I'm glad you pointed that out.
And this example in particular, the repetition, I actually think could be intentional, and maybe the whole point is to have it feel the way that it does feel.
Yeah.
The introduction to the translation I read of Anna Karenina said that they went through and they made different choices than translators have in the past. So this is being translated. That book was translated from Russian into English. And this particular group, I'm going to say their names wrong, but Peviar and Volenhovsky,
Okay.
they worked really hard on it. And what they tried to do is if there was some repetition, they actually left it in. Where the original translations into English may have eliminated some of that repetition. And they think it was very intentional by the author. He used the same word twice. He actually wants that same word to be used because it, especially for a character's dialogue, communicates their personality through that.
Yeah.
And I'm much more open to some of the stuff that might sound odd to us might be intentional and communicate exactly what he meant to.
That's true.
There's also the possibility that that's just how he wrote it.
Yeah, that's right. Well, as Curdie and Irene approach, she yells out, "Papa, Papa, here I am!" And the color rushes back to the king's face. He's so excited. He gave an inarticulate cry, and Curdie holds up the princess, and she gets wrapped up by the king. So exciting, great happy ending here. And this is where Irene says, I must tell you, she tells the whole story. She says all the great things Curdie's done. She says, I need to tell you another thing. She's like, Ludi, she was, she's got some problems, Dad, right? Yeah. She like throws Ludi under the bus. She says, I must tell you another thing. One night long ago, Curdie drove the goblins away and brought Ludi and me safe from the mountain. And I promised him a kiss when we got home, but Ludi wouldn't let me give it to him. I would not have you scold Ludi, but I want you to impress upon her that a princess must do as she promises.
I feel like Ludi's not going to make book 2
Yeah.
without some major performance improvement plan.
Yeah. I don't think the king is going to execute her, but she's certainly, the performance plan is there.
Right.
It's one of those like, hey, we don't want to let you go. We think you have the potential, but we really need to see you step it up. Right.
Because you're kind of damaging the princess's reputation.
Yeah. But the king does say that, yes, my child, indeed she must. There, give Curdie a kiss. And then she goes, as she, and we're not a little surprised, a kiss on the mouth, which we were told. Did that surprise you at all?
No.
No, you expected it?
No, just this is so far removed from our reality
That's true.
But she already gave him a kiss on the cheek. It has to be.
I guess that's true, because I was like, well, now I'm like kind of on Ludi's side. Do you know what I mean? Like,
well, and it does get a little bit odd when you consider
because
the whole crowd's watching. They're pretty young.
Yeah, I mean, Irene's what, 7, 8 years old, and Curdie's supposed to be like 12 or 13, right? So I'm like kind of understand Ludi's. Again, this is not even remotely romantic. We're being a little silly here. It's not supposed to be like that at all. But it's just like, oh, okay, well, maybe this is something that reading it now in the 21st century, like, oh, it kind of makes Ludi seem like pretty reasonable.
Yeah. And that's a good point, actually.
And then here you go. One more thing that C.S. Lewis wouldn't have done. Here's the final paragraph of this chapter. Then they all went into the house, and the cook rushed to the kitchen, and the servants to their work. Ludi dressed Irene in her shiningest clothes, and the king put off his armor and put on purple and gold. And a messenger was sent for Peter and all the miners, and there was a great and grand feast, which continued long after the princess was put to bed. Again, there's just no way that Jack writes that without it being
Without
pages of the kind of food that they have there.
I also love that everybody's hanging out and celebrating, and the princess has to go to bed.
Yeah.
They can't stay up. Ludi probably said something.
Oh, you think so? I think it's like Ludi's fault. We gotta get this girl to bed. Just for some context, before we end the chapter, I wanted to read a paragraph I just found really quickly today. And there's many places we could have pulled from. I pulled from Prince Caspian here just because it was on my mind. Here's what Lewis has to say when he's describing at the very end of Caspian. This is in chapter, where am I? This is chapter 14. Aslan makes a door in the air. That's the final chapter. Here's how Lewis describes some celebrating. Then Bacchus and Silenus and the Maenads began a dance, far wilder than the dance of the trees. Not merely a dance for fun and beauty, though it was that too, but a magic dance of plenty. And where their hands touched and where their feet fell, the feast came into existence. Sides of roasted meat that filled the grove with delicious smell, and wheaten cakes and oaten cakes, honey and many-colored sugars, and cream as thick as porridge and as smooth as still water, peaches, nectarines, pomegranates, pears, grapes, strawberries, raspberries, pyramids and cataracts of food. Then, in great wooden cups and bowls and mazers, wreathed with ivy, came the wines, dark, thick ones like syrups of mulberry juice, and clear red ones like red jellies liquefied, and yellow wines and yellow-green and greenish-yellow. And it goes on at some point too, but I'll stop there. But he keeps going on talking a little bit more about the food for the tree people, because the tree people get their own kind of food as well too. And now, this is not me trying to put down George MacDonald as like a lesser writer or something. It's just
there's something too, and there was a great and grand feast. Enough said. You don't have to describe all that.
I just think it's funny because of the things that are so similar between these two authors, and yet we know Lewis thought it was really important to talk about the food.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, this is like, I write about this because I like it, and yet it's just funny that MacDonald has none of that in his writing.
Yeah. Very different.
Well, any final thoughts here about these 3 chapters, Phil?
So, in the context of not having read the next 2 chapters, we're going to pretend because we've read this book multiple times.
Sure, okay.
But it is interesting that what happens next. Why are there 2 more chapters?
Okay.
Why not end right here? And I'm curious what the thinking was behind adding a little bit more. Is it simply to have a smoother off ramp as the story wraps up? Is there something else that's going to be set up? Are they super short chapters? Are they less than 2 pages?
But you know all the answers to
I
these
know the
questions.
answers to all these things, but it's an interesting. And 30 chapters is a nice bundle for a book.
Sure.
And you could cut it off right there at the end with the grand feast.
This really could be the end of the book.
And it would leave you wanting more. And spoiler alert, I was left wanting more, even though I read the next 2 chapters.
I was just saying that the chapter 32, literally called the last chapter, ends really interestingly. And the book has different endings depending on if you're reading the one where the author's speaking to the readers.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we'll talk about that next
those
time.
differences.
But yeah, it is interesting that in these next 2 chapters, which we'll go ahead and say next time, our episode, will be called The Flood. And in that chapter, the goblins' plan to flood the kingdom actually occurs.
Yeah.
They're actually able to flood the castle.
Yep.
And we'll talk through that. Chapter 31 is called The Subterranean Waters, and 32 is called The Last Chapter.
I love that.
He was like, I'm done. I've had enough. I'm not
can't.
naming any more of these things. Any final thoughts before we've got listener feedback today?
Let's hear the email.
So we have Phil an email today. It is about Narnia. We've got a couple of McDonald emails. We'll save those maybe for the end of this season. We're going to travel back to the last battle. We've got an email from Sarah. It is entitled Puzzle, and I'm going to read parts of it.
It's about that talking donkey.
It is. I'm going to read parts of it that have to do with our friend Puzzle. Sarah says, I've just listened to your episode concerning the rescue of Jewel and Puzzle just a few chapters into the last battle. I have a few considerations regarding Puzzle and the question of his guilt. Remember, you and I talked kind of ad nauseum about this. How guilty is Puzzle?
Right.
And we talked a lot about it, and then we both had forgotten that Puzzle is literally there in the new heavens and the new earth.
Yeah.
And so it's pretty clear that he is not culpable. I mean, he is, but he's forgiven, right? She says, I have a few considerations regarding Puzzle and the question of his guilt, responsibility, and possible punishment. He is definitely a victim of abuse, both verbally and spiritually, so that factors into the mix. There are some scriptures which may shed light on the situation. The first is the saga of the people of Israel in Exodus. After God freed them from many years of abuse in Egypt, he gave them many chances to obey him in the wilderness, but did not absolve them from guilt when they chose disbelief and disobedience when it was the time to receive the commandments, and when it was time to enter the promised land. They, in fact, had to wait till all adults had died and the next generation were adults to have the privilege of entering. Oh, that's a good connection. I like this. She then goes on, Sarah goes on to talk about another consideration from the book of Deuteronomy, especially when it comes to someone who is assaulted, and how there were laws in place in the time of the Israelites that if someone were to like scream out or cry out, they were absolved of guilt. And so she goes on, Sarah, to say that by these arguments, we might conclude that Puzzle, although he is someone to be pitied, was still culpable because he didn't cry out whenever Shift allowed other creatures near. There's this like clear statement that if he had just once let out a bray, the game would be up, right? Again, yeah. I love this idea, okay, because the idea is that every time he's paraded out, all he would have to do is just bray like a donkey and the gig is up.
Right. Everyone would know.
Everybody would know, but he doesn't. And I wish we had this email back in season 7 because or whatever. Yeah, it was season 7, right? Because this helps us understand why especially I was so frustrated with him as a character, and yet we know that he is ultimately forgiven. Yeah, so that's kind of the gist of Sarah's email. What do you think about that?
I love that. I feel like that's a perfect example of him being silent was a problem.
Yeah.
He had plenty of opportunities to do something about it, and he let his fear get in the way, or let the inaction never change. And it was easier to stay, and then it builds and builds and builds because he hasn't. It's going to be worse for him if he reveals it later.
Because it is worse for him because of it later.
Yeah, He hasn't told people yet, so it's a little easier to just keep going.
Yeah. Well, Phil, that's a great place for us to stop. We've got one more episode of The Princess and the Goblin. Would you like to go ahead and finish this off for us?
I would love to. This episode is made possible by our patrons over at patreon.com. If you'd like to support the show, you too can then listen to a bonus episode each month along with other rewards. Special thanks goes to John Marr, Emily Wakefield, Ryan Smith, Ender Trophy, Becca Brown, Christiana Line, and Ian Wooten for supporting us at our top tiers. Listener feedback can be sent to hello@lampostlistener.com. Voicemails can be left at 406-646-6733. Previous episodes, links, and book information can be found at lampostlistener.com. A review on Apple Podcasts will help other listeners find this show. Thanks for coming along on this journey, and we will be back very soon.